Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's program, part two of an extended conversation. We're so pleased to present this with Professor Joseph Ellis on the Jefferson-Adams letters. And just a fascinating conversation this week.
Yeah, I'm in one place. Joseph Ellis is in another in Vermont. David Swenson is in a third. We're practicing social distancing. That makes it a little bit more difficult technically, but we're having a great conversation. Let me tell you the origins of this. For a long time, I've wanted to help Joseph Ellis debrief. He has another book, maybe five more, to write, but he's towards the end of a long and extremely distinguished career as an American historian, and he's filled, as you know, with insights and humor and
He's great guy,
and wit, and an enormous sense of perspective, looking back on his examinations of the life of Washington, the life of Jefferson, the life of Hamilton, the life of John and Abigail Adams, and so on. And so I've wanted to have this opportunity just to have a sustained dialogue with him, and he's agreed to it because he's in a sense trapped in place in Vermont, and this gives us some opportunities that we might not have been able to schedule otherwise. So it's really great.
Like he said, who else do I have to talk to? But I mean, these are very important programs to me. They are to listen to the two of you exchange knowledge, ideas about all of this. And when I first started the show back when I was like 15 years old, I think.
Yes.
And so are you. One of the first books I read at your recommendation was American Sphinx by Joseph Ellis. And because of this conversation, I've gone back and found my dog-eared copy of it and begun to read it again. He is so good. He's just a joy to read.
He is, in his other book, Passionate Sage, which is about the life of John Adams, he spends about half the book on the correspondence between 1812 and 1826 between these two old patriarchs. And I believe of all the books that have ever been written on the correspondence, that's the best of them. He has the greatest insights. And so it's a pleasure just to throw him a question and step back and watch what he does with it. And, he's carrying a lot of this just in a memory of a lifetime of historical research. And he talks about his relations with his students. He's emeritus now, but when he was still teaching, he would have the students read it, and they would sort of choose sides and say they like Jefferson on this question better than Adams, or Adams' general tone better than that of Jefferson. And he liked to sort of have them weigh in as if they were kind of a jury of historical students on this truly remarkable correspondence. So let me echo what he said. If you're interested, the book to read is edited by Lester Capon. It's called The Adams-Jefferson Letters. It includes every known letter between Abigail Adams and Jefferson and between John Adams and Jefferson, beginning in the 1770s, but going all the way up to just a few weeks before their simultaneous death on July 4th, 1826. So you can find it all in one spectacular volume. It's Lester Capon, Cappon, the Adams-Jefferson Letters.
All of these are available online. You can either order a hard copy or an ebook. Well, then let's go to the show. But before we do, I know your performance schedule is pretty limited because of the pandemic. Is there anything that you want to share with people that you have upcoming?
Yes, the Lewis and Clark trip is still on for late July, so unless the country is still shut down by then, we're planning to do our canoeing and hike one more time up the Wendover Hill. And I'm doing two online courses, one starting almost immediately. You can get more information about these at the jeffersonhour.com site, one on pandemics in history and literature, and the second, more ambitious one will be 8 weeks, 8-part series on what is the Enlightenment and where is it headed now. This is a really rich subject. So go to the Jefferson Hour site, you'll find out more, or just contact me through. You can write to me at the Jefferson Hour site, and I can send you details as they emerge. We're kind of scrambling here, but we want very much to experiment with a Jefferson Hour online course. And my book, Repairing Jefferson's America, will soon be available for shipping from Amazon.com, or you can order it, of course, at your closest independent bookstore. The January retreats are on. One on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the decision to drop the atomic bomb, and the other one on Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. So, David, all of that is coming, and we will be doing more of these sort of special remote editions of the Jefferson Hour in the weeks ahead. And people can, I think this is where you say people can support this program.
Right. It is. It's in these times we're living in, we need your support more than ever. And we so appreciate it. And you can do that by going to jeffersonhour.com. Even if you just write us a letter, which, by the way, I must say, we have been getting a lot of messaging and emails and posts, and we need to devote a show in the very near future to more reports from people, how they're dealing with the pandemic. And there's some great questions that have come in. So hopefully in between these fabulous conversations with Professor Ellis, we'll be able to do that too.
People can write to us, but we'll also get Jefferson in costume here one of these days, because we're getting a lot of questions for the third president of the United States too. People understand why we're focusing out of character here on these debates and conversations with Dr. Ellis. But we do need to have Mr. Jefferson check in, as he is wont to do. So all that's coming in programs soon.
And with that, let's go to the show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, part 2 of our discussion about the Adams-Jefferson letters. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and Professor Joseph Ellis. Last week, in part 1 of this conversation about the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson between 1812 and 1826, the two of you talked about how the correspondence began, particularly the involvement of Abigail Adams and Benjamin Rush. And it really is an extraordinary, unprecedented collection of correspondence between two former presidents. Wouldn't you agree, Joe Ellis?
Yeah, let me ask Clay a question. If you went over all the presidents in American history, can you imagine any two other former presidents having a correspondence like this?
No, and there are many reasons why. I'll start and you pick it up, because I know you have lots to say about this too.
Yeah.
The range of their discourse. So yeah, I've been looking particularly at the letters between 1812 and 1815, and they talk about classical literature at great length. They talk about the origins of Native Americans, Native American spirituality, the sachems and the medicine men and the medical religious experiences of Native peoples, the resistance by Native Americans to white encroachment. They talk about religion in terms of Jefferson. One of Jefferson's letters has been leaked, and Jefferson is emerging as a free thinker, and Adams is defending him. And then they get into this long discussion of what really is essential to Christianity. And what is peripheral and is
the ranges but they're both classically educated, and especially in these early letters. See if you agree with me that there's one letter that Jefferson says, well, I've given up newspapers and reading the current stuff. I'm giving it up for going back to Euclid. He says Euclid, Thucydides, and Tacitus, and I think that's right, and I don't have the text before me. And Adams writes back and says, yes, but I've given up. I've read Thucydides and Tacitus so many times, often in the original Greek. And it's like, okay, you're showing off your classical origins or knowledge. I'm going to show you mine. And, it's Harvard against William and Mary or UVA or whatever. And there's a kind of pleasant or friendly warfare here about who's better read, and there's not too many people that can match either one of them. I would say that Jefferson is better read across the spectrum of politics, science, history, and everything else. Adams is better read in history and in politics, but he can't match Jefferson when you get into things like the arts or science.
I agree with you entirely, but And just to add one more element to that, in a playful way, they're competitive about who has more grandchildren than great-grandchildren. That goes on. And in a more melancholy way, that they enumerate how many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence are still alive, and they note the death of each one of them. And
well, they also get into competition of who can, if they form a book about all this stuff written about you by people out to get you, by hired, what they'll call opposition research teams, who would have the biggest book? And Jefferson says he's started to put a book together about all the people that have written against him. And Adams says, what a great idea. I'd never thought of that. I'm going to do that too. And I'll bet you my book is larger than your book.
And he would be right.
And he would be right.
The actual quote that you were referring to is, into politics, of which I have taken final leave. I think little of them and say less. I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, and I find myself much the happier.
There you go.
But Joe, back to your statement, which is of any two presidents in American history, who could possibly have written a more important and rich correspondence? And there's a bigger issue here, and it's your issue. It's your insight that they were not just exchanging weather notations and their views of Christianity and classical literature. Adams was right that the revolution could not really be finally over or interpreted until these two great patriarchs, who represent opposite ends of the view of human nature, wrestled it to the ground. So what's the meaning of the revolution? For Adams, the revolution is a separation followed by a somewhat idealized but realistic progression towards a freer society. And for Jefferson, the revolution is a line of demarcation between the old world and the new world is going to vindicate the human project in some extraordinary and as yet unresolved way. And Adams' view is, yeah, really, Mr. Jefferson, you can't possibly believe that, because that's not how life works. And Jefferson's view seems to be, John Adams, don't be straitjacketed by the habits of thinking of the old world. Wake up to the possibilities of the American dream. And I agree with that. Jefferson likes Tom Paine a lot. I mean, Jefferson and Paine think alike in this regard. That this is a new world we're creating, a totally new kind of society that's going to break with the European past, the Dark Ages. We're exiting the cave into a fundamentally enlightened world. And this is a real revolution. And Adams is saying, well, I've read the same Enlightenment books you have, but in my view, revolutions only succeed when they're evolutionary. You can't attempt to implement the full agenda of the American Revolution, meaning the equality of women, the end of slavery, racial equality, the end of the property qualification. All those things are things which we got to get done, but if we try to do them all at once, the guillotine is coming our way. This puts us in touch with the theme I know you want to talk about today. So in one of the key letters, Adams basically says to Jefferson, look, equality is an idea, but beware of falling in love with it, because if you had a tyrant or some sort of a dictator or God who could create every single human being on earth equally, that doesn't solve the problem, because you can't shave down the inevitable inequalities of beauty, birth, talent, strength, ambition, that no matter how you try to shake it out, there can be no communism of humanity, because humanity is a hierarchy of difference, and the rage for distinction is the number one human urge. So this may be a wonderful illusion that you have, Mr. Jefferson, but it just can't work.
This is big stuff you're talking here, Clay, and you know it. I hope our listeners get it too. That is, I mean, the most important thing Jefferson ever did was to write the first 55 words of the Declaration. And those are the American Creed, became the American Creed. And they are, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with, how do I say it? With
certain inalienable rights.
Certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He changes the Lockean trinity from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is, he did that on his own. But that's the American promise. That's what Lincoln loves him for. That's what Franklin Roosevelt will love him for. That's what America loves him for. And what Adams is saying is, okay, yeah, I get it. We are all equal in the sense that we are human beings. We have a core, a soul that is equal. But that doesn't mean that, and that means we have equal rights. But it doesn't mean that we have equal abilities. It doesn't mean that we are a truly egalitarian society. And they get into this, and maybe this is what we should do, in which, Adams says, again, the text is not before me, I'm up here in the mountains of Vermont, that there are these virtues like truth and reason, but there are other things like beauty and wealth, and that those distinguish among people. And he goes to a foundry in Paris and looks at all of these, not a foundry, what do you call it, a hospital where orphans
Humblings.
are. Right. And he says, all those kids are going to lead lives not nearly as successful and happy as my children, because they're born into that. And he says, it's interesting that so many of your Southern friends who inherited estates, including slaves, are advocates of equality. And this is a guy who's the son of a person who's a farmer and a shoemaker. Yeah. And so that what we mean by equality is at stake here. It's still at stake. And there's this fundamental fight throughout American history about this. This is the ultimate, what, do you believe in freedom or do you believe in equality? And Adams says, if you really believe in freedom as a sole virtue, you're going to generate more inequality. Because free people allowed to pursue their interests are going to succeed, and some because of greater inheritance or because of greater natural ability, greater strength, greater mental aptitude, and if you don't have government there to redistribute wealth, we're going to create what later will be called the Gilded Age.
Joe, the exact quote from Adams is, "The 5 pillars of aristocracy are beauty, wealth, birth, genius, and virtues," all with capital letters, by the way. "Any of the first 3 can at any time overbear any of both the last 2. In other words, genius and virtues will almost automatically be overturned by the aristocracy of beauty, wealth, and birth." We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want to ask Dr. Joseph Ellis about the dispute that Jefferson, or the debate, let's say, that Jefferson and Adams had about what you do with the aristocrats in your society. You're listening to a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And we'll be back with Clay Jenkinson and Professor Joseph Ellis in just a moment.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're having a conversation with our dearest friend in the historical world, Dr. Joseph Ellis, now an emeritus professor, and at the moment at an undisclosed cabin somewhere in Vermont, waiting out the pandemic, like a character out of Boccaccio's Decameron. Joe, you got plenty to read up there, don't you?
I do, but I neglected to bring Lester Cappin's edition of the correspondence with me. I've got a lot of other places that I can find it, I guess, but I'm depending on you to get the quotes right now.
You're giving me a rare moment of ascendancy here. I happen to have Lester Cappin's book right in front of me. And I'm looking at this letter. So here's Adams' view. You tell me if I'm caricaturing it. Adams' view is, look, Mr. Jefferson, let's forget about our ideals. in any society, there are going to be aristocrats. The people that are most powerful, the most privileged, the ones that always wind up on top, the ones with the most property, the ones that seize power and keep it and perpetuate it, if possible, to their own clans. This is inevitable. There's no way to get around it. So because it's inevitable, we may as well give them the Senate so that we can watch them. We'll put them in. We'll give them a role so that we can collect them together and find out what their program is, and then we can check them with the House of Representatives and with the state governments. If you don't do that, they're going to be more mischievous than if you find them some constitutional role, because you can't get rid of them no matter what you try to do. Is that fair?
It is. The notion that we're going to always have some kind of political and economic elite, and that I think that's a profound insight on Adams's part, and we can explain why. But the notion that you're going to control them by putting them in the Senate is a ridiculous idea. He doesn't know what to do with these aristocrats, and he's trying to come up with a specific answer, and the answer is just loony. I don't know whether he knows it. I don't think he does, Adams, I mean. But that they get into this in which Adams is saying aristocracies are inevitable. All societies have them. You can't believe that we've changed human nature by this revolution. You can't believe that once you come across the Atlantic, Americans are going to behave fundamentally different than Europeans for the last 2,000 years. And aristocracies always emerge. And you sort of can't do without them, because there are a lot of gifted people in that group. But that we have to be, we can't pretend to believe that we're going to be an egalitarian society. And Jefferson says, and you can expand on this because you know it, he says, well, there are two kinds of aristocracies. There's the lawyer's way of dealing with this, and both of them are lawyers, by the way, make a distinction. There's the tinsel, artificial aristocracy of Europe, which is an inherited form of aristocracy. We don't have that. We don't have any moats. We don't have any castles. We don't have any House of Lords. We have a natural aristocracy. And guess what? You and I are examples of it. The people of merit who rose to the occasion during the Revolution. And the natural aristocracy is a good thing, and you don't have to worry about it. And Adams is then saying, well, even within the United States, even though we do not have a feudal society, we have human beings that are always striving to do better and to outdistance their peers. And there are always going to be inequalities. And if you remove any form of government control over that, what you're going to get is a plutocracy. That is to say, a government that's run by wealth. And we have to find ways to prevent that. Now, his way of preventing it, putting them in the Senate, is just crazy. But his identification of the problem is, I think, profound.
So let me give you the passage, because this is October 28, 1813. This is Jefferson's response to Adams. And I think, Joe, it's one of the greatest single passages ever written by the great Thomas Jefferson. I'll quote it. It takes about a minute.
Okay.
For I agree with you, says Jefferson, that there is a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talents. Formerly, bodily powers gave place among the aristoi, but since the invention of gunpowder has armed the weak as well as the strong with missile death, bodily strength like beauty, good humor, politeness, and other accomplishments has become but an auxiliary ground of distinction. There is also an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth without either virtue or talents, for with these it would belong to the first class. The natural aristocracy I consider as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and the government of society, and indeed, it would have been inconsistent in creation to have formed man for the social state and not to have provided virtue and wisdom enough to manage the concerns of that society. May we not even say that the form of government is best which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi to the offices of government. The artificial aristocracy is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy. How
You're
about
right.
that, John?
That is great stuff. Just try to imagine if there was a presidential debate in the fall of 2020 and Joe Biden and Donald Trump were able to talk that way. They, of course, that's ridiculous, but that Jefferson is making an extraordinarily potent argument for a society that has intelligent people, gifted people who rise to the top, not because of their genealogy, but because of their ability. And that's what, and that's the kind of egalitarianism he's for. I think, stepping back, I would say Jefferson is looking at a kind of society that is possible to imagine in a pre-industrial, pre-capitalistic world. That the reason Jefferson is so committed to the agrarian idea, even though he himself never walked behind a plow in his whole life, is that it's not a society that's driven by wealth. It's people are acting on the basis of day-to-day provisions, etc. Anyway, and there's not that much wealth washing around in the society. Once that changes by the end of the 19th century, the conditions that Jefferson presumes necessary for that kind of equality to exist become anachronistic. And there's somewhere, and I can't find it because I tried to look this up, where he says, when we cease being an agrarian society, all the values that I hold dear will become irrelevant, and thank God I will not live to see it.
Yeah, one of those is a letter to Madison, and the other is the famous passage in Notes on Virginia where he says, those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. But let me disagree with you, my dear friend.
Okay.
I think in many respects we have built Jefferson's natural aristocracy, what we would call a meritocracy. The great universities, you've taught at several of them.
Yeah.
It takes people from the plains of Kansas and from Wadena, Minnesota, and Native Americans from the Navajo and from the Shoshone, and they bring them to these great centers of learning, Brown, Mount Holyoke, Boston College, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Williams, etc., Bryn Mawr. And they train them in the liberal arts and the great tradition. And these people often go on to be either justices of the courts or clerks. They become professors. They become writers. They become physicians. They work with Doctors Without Borders. They are the heads of the great foundations of this country. They're what Donald Trump would call the deep state. But there is a meritocracy in the United States that somehow has to exist side by side with the oligarchy and the plutocracy and the corruptionists. But I think you will agree that it has been astonishingly successful in doing what Jefferson said, which is that natural aristocrats are as often born in hovels and wigwams as they are in palaces. And it's the purpose of a great society to go get them and then give them the tools they need to be the extraordinary ones that lead us into the future.
Well, that's a good argument, and it's one that part of my mind believes in. Gosh knows I devoted 44 years of my life to teaching at those kind of places. And in believing that that's precisely what I was doing, and I think that the higher education system of the United States is the best in the world. I think that our the lower grades in the grade schools, middle schools, and high schools are failing us in that regard. However, and that I would make the case that over 50% of the population of the United States could not pass the civics test required of all immigrants to become citizens. I don't believe the current president of the United States could pass that test. And I think that the internet and the kind of exchanges you see there are an airburst in the night as to the fact that there is a significant portion of the United States which is ignorant of its history and of anything. That the dialogue we're describing between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams is just a terra incognita. So that we've succeeded at the highest levels educationally, but not at the lowest. And that we have a government now that is a plutocracy. It's exactly what Adams feared. Where money is the driving force, where the first question you ask when you're going to run for office is, is who do we have as donors? The second question is who do we hire for opposition research? And so that I don't think either one of them would look at the government we currently are living with and say that's what we had in mind. And I think that Adams's forecast of the power of wealth in society and its ability to influence government is prescient. I think that Jefferson's dream and Jefferson's promise is still there. I mean, God knows it's still there. But we've drifted away from it over the last 50 years.
See what's happening here, Joe. We're pretending to be historians, but you're channeling Adams and I'm channeling Jefferson. I'm making the claim for the possibilities of the natural aristocrats and the meritocracy and the redemption of the American Republic. And your view is, yeah, that's fine, but money talks and birth talks. And so it's amazing that temperamentally, we all have to choose, don't we? I mean, we pretend to be historians, that we can look dispassionately and objectively at all these things and weigh the evidence and so on. But ultimately, this is a question of temperament. Are you a Jeffersonian? Are you an Adamsite? And each of us has probably shifted in our views in the course of our lives. But it is amazing that you sort of have to choose, don't you?
I think that, I guess, yes, but I hope you'll agree. I now think quite pessimistically about the political culture of the United States. But I still believe we're going to survive this current crisis, and our future is still ahead of us. But I don't believe they want to look back. America's greatness is not behind us. And so back to the dialogue. Although I tend to find Adams more compatible with my own values, I still see in Jefferson something that I want to believe in. Just as Adams did. I still hold on to that in some way that's deep and that simply will never go away.
Good for you, sir. I agree with you, and I'm in that camp as well. But you're channeling Jefferson, you're channeling Adams. I hear this little roar, so I will channel a certain segment of our listeners. Clay, you said that Jefferson believed that the leaders of the next generation can be born anywhere as long as they're white male, right?
Yeah.
Not just white male, but white. Jefferson did not ever make the turn and credit African American or black capacity. Whenever he saw evidence of the capacity of African Americans, he found one or another reasons to put an asterisk in that equation, and that's a deep indictment of Thomas Jefferson. Even if you make adjustments for the era in which he lived and the Virginia in which he was born, Adams was had a much fuller sense of liberty and equality than Jefferson did in that respect. As to women, Jefferson believed in intelligent women and women that would contribute in important ways to American life, but they were going to do it from within the home. They were going to be whispering in the ears of their husbands who were statesmen and lawyers and justices and so on. So he gets a C- maybe on questions of gender, whereas Adams gets an A-. It has to be a minus, Joe. He did say, we'd rather fight than give in to you, Abigail Adams.
He said the tyranny of the petticoat. There was a moment when Albert Gallatin, Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury, a very, very important guy who's not given credit that he deserves, suggested that maybe they should appoint a woman to the cabinet. And Jefferson said, I do not believe the American people are ready for this, nor may I add, am I. Nobody's ready for that in the late 18th century. I think that the race thing is the original sin of America and still with us. Slavery is its clearest institutional embodiment. One of the things that Jefferson believed here, most people don't know this. You remember some letters he exchanged with people up in New York and in northern states, and they would report that there's a black guy, an African, who's a freed slave living there, and he's turning white.
Oh, yes.
Remember this? And
yes.
You think, what are they talking about? Remember, they're pre-Mendel. They think, Jefferson thought, that Africans were black because they lived close to the equator. And if you move that population to North America, over time, it would turn white. And when that happened, you could admit them as full citizens, but not until then. And that's the reason when he freed some of his own slaves, the ones he freed were the ones that could pass for white, his own children in some cases. The African-American population, he's writing a famous letter, I think it's to Monroe, in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase. And Monroe says, well, maybe what we can do, we can free the blacks with the money that we get from selling the land, and we can move them out there to the West, which is what, and we don't have to send them back to Africa or send them to the Dominican Republic. And Jefferson says, and this is the same letter where he comes up with a great phrase, that the Empire of Liberty, but which he also says there's two reasons we can't put them out there. One is because that's where we're going to put the Native Americans, and they won't get along. But the second is we can have no blot on the American Republic. And he conceives of race as a blot. Blackness is a blot. And
you're listening to a very special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with Joseph Ellis. Needless to say, Dr. Ellis and I do not, or David Swinson, agree with these ideas that were circulating in the brain of Thomas Jefferson between 1743 and 1826. Joe, these are hard things to talk about.
They are. It's just, Jefferson is the most resonant figure, resonant figure in American history, because he straddles the greatest insights and the worst instincts.
And you have said on this program, I think about a half a year ago, that the recent events in America have brought some of these things back to the forefront. I think you said we used to play our race card face down. More recently, we've been playing it face up again.
I think that's true. But that said, if somebody says, do you support us tearing down the Jefferson Memorial? Hell no. Let's keep him there, and keep him there as a person that we can understand, and understand our own history better, the bad side as well as the good. So I'm not in favor of just eliminating, trying to make us forget this. It's not something we should forget, but it's only a part of the story.
You called it America's original sin.
Yeah.
You didn't call it Jefferson's sin.
No, he's part of it. None of the founders, none of them, believed in the possibilities of a biracial society.
We need to take a short break, gentlemen, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're having a series of dialogues with our friend Dr. Joseph Ellis, who is at an undisclosed cabin up in the wilds of Vermont.
Hey, this is a really nice cabin. This is not really a shack we're talking about here up here, Clay. And this is the green mountains of Vermont.
I had you as Henry David Thoreau. You're saying it's a little bit more luxurious than that.
Luxurious, no, but comfortable, yes.
And so you've got plenty to read, and you're thinking about, of course, a lifetime of just extraordinary historical achievement. Let's go back to race for just one moment to end that discussion on a somewhat happier note. John Adams is an abolitionist.
Adams thought there was an unspoken agreement between the New England states and Virginia and the southern states that slavery was the most explosive issue facing the new republic. If you faced it frontally, it had the potential to explode the entire Republican experiment. And this happened both in 76 during the debate over the Jenkinson draft of what kind of government we're going to have, and then again in the Constitutional Convention. There was this understanding, he thought. He wrote this to John Quincy. We will do nothing to end slavery because that's your job. And he talked about the Virginians, and that meant Jefferson, to take the leadership here because it's your interest that's at stake. We all agree this is a fundamental contradiction in our republic. Nobody disagrees with that. Even the Southern slave owners don't disagree with that at that time. But we will do nothing and let you lead and gradually end this thing. And by 1819, 1820, with the Missouri crisis, he realizes that's not going to happen and that slavery is going to expand. And he says to John Quincy, he doesn't say this to Jefferson. It's too explosive. He can't say this to Jefferson. Okay, boy, go get him. We give him a chance, and they didn't do it. And John Quincy becomes a major force for the end of slavery in the Congress later on in his career. So that they thought, they, meaning the founders as a whole, that slavery was ending, that it was a vestige of the feudal era, that it could not compete successfully with free labor, and that if you just held it and didn't let it spread, it would die a natural death. That wasn't true. They didn't foresee the cotton gin. They didn't foresee the cotton kingdom. And when it becomes clear that that's the case, and action at the national level has to happen, Jefferson backs off again and won't do it. And instantly says it must be left to the next generation.
Here's what he did say, Adams, to Jefferson. So when the Missouri crisis came, Adams wrote one of the most subtle and graceful letters of the correspondence, and he says something like this to Jefferson, Joe. He says, I was never going to bring this up. And it's been my position to be silent on it because I don't think that outside interference on this is likely to have the slightest good effect. But, he says, now that the country is almost coming apart over the question of expansion of slavery into the West, I can't help but finally to bring this up to you, my friend. And he said, I have these dreams, and I see black armies and white armies marching in the night. I see wars of extermination, and I don't know what to do about it. And then he ends that famous letter, and he says, but again, I don't mean to be telling you what you should do and how you should operate. All I'm telling you is that I have deep fears about the future of this country now.
Mm-hmm. That's a good quote. I remember it. And what he could have also said, but he didn't, but it would have been nice to say it, that Jefferson was the first person to argue. He did this in 1784 when he was on a committee in the Congress before he went over to Paris to be ambassador. He was on this committee to establish rules for the development of the Northwest Territory. And one of his principles was, when new territories apply for statehood in the Northwest Territories, they have to end slavery. They cannot continue to have slavery. He was an advocate for saying that the West could not be under slavery. And he changes his position later. And why he changes it is a long, long conversation that we don't want to rehearse here, but he simply doesn't want to be a leader on this issue later because he's uncomfortable with argument. He's uncomfortable with being the only Virginian taking this position. Once Washington took this, Washington believed that you couldn't afford to talk about slavery nationally until 1809, which was when officially they were going to end the slave trade. But then you could do it. But you want Jefferson to come through on this one, and he doesn't.
Let me change the subject here, Joe. I'm quoting from another letter by Adams, and I want you to comment on this. He seems to have felt the need to tear down some of his fellow statesmen. He actually says that Washington was forced from office in 1796, that he wanted a third term. He says that Washington
is overrated. Does he say that, really?
Yeah, he does. He says Franklin was overrated. He says that, of course, Tom Paine was overrated. And he goes on and on. Here's a passage from a letter on July 13th, 1813. He's talking about his famous writings about constitutions. He said, when I read all of these other writers, I was astonished at the grossness of their ignorance. I had been for years before knowing that Turgot, Rochefoucauld, Condorcet, and Franklin were filled with gross ideology, that they were all imbeciles. Why does he do that? Why does Adams feel the need to take on someone like Condorcet or George Washington or Benjamin Franklin when he has no need? He only brings himself lower in our estimation when he insists upon doing this.
I completely agree, and I've written about this in Passionate Sage. Part of it is on the American side of things, he sees that the history is not going to give him the role of prominence that it's going to give Jefferson and some other people. And so if he's not going to be on the mantle with all the others, he's like a wrecking ball that's going to destroy all their reputations.
That really bothered Adams. In your book, American Sphinx, you talk briefly about the Mecklenburg Declaration.
Oh yeah, there's this document that appears from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and it purports to be a document written in about 1773 or 4 that has almost exactly the same language that Jefferson used in the Declaration. We hold these truths and all that. And people were saying, well, wait a minute, maybe Jefferson got his ideas from this document that nobody knew about.
Including Mr. Adams.
Yeah, and Adams writes, Jefferson says, oh, what about this Mecklenburg Declaration? And Jefferson says, and Adams accepts this, at least in the correspondence. Well, I never knew about it, and it's probably a hoax that somebody else did, which is probably correct. But Adams writes his other friends at the time, says, Jefferson claims he didn't know about it, but I can't believe that's really true. I mean, it's too much exactly the same thing. And so he's not telling Jefferson what he really thinks.
Yes, and Jefferson is pretty thin-skinned in that exchange.
Yes,
he's very offended that the charge that he plagiarized or that he was using commonplaces from the
that the Declaration, and especially the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of the Declaration, are his ticket to immortality. And he knows that. And that's the reason he puts it first. And so you don't mess around with that. If you mess around with that, he's going to be upset. So both of them, although Adams much more so, are really after the securing of their own legacy.
But Jefferson is secure in his legacy, generally speaking, and his posture, at least in this correspondence, is that of serenity, equanimity, calm, confidence. He always says, we leave this to posterity. They will judge who was right or what was the best and most enlightened path. But on a few issues, events or Adams are able to get under his skin. And as you say, none more so than when the uniqueness and primacy of the Declaration are called into question.
There's no question that the immediate future belongs to Jefferson. We talk about Jeffersonian America. I mean, there's not even a word to describe Adams as American. What is Adamite, Adamsonian? We don't even have a word, you know?
It must have driven him nuts.
And guess what? Adams knows that, and he's really upset about it. And I'm saying that part of my career as a historian was to bring him back alive, and not because he's perfect, but because he's imperfect. And but he's a realist in a way that Jefferson isn't, and that tradition is important, and that he is the most eloquent voice for it. And I mean, I testified with some people before the Congress for an Adams memorial. Somewhere there's no memorial to Adams on the mall.
Oh, there's that plaque in the White House.
That what? Oh, the plaque. May all men who come here be, what does it say? Yeah, it's still there. And the wing of the Library of Congress is still there. And it got caught up in congressional subcommittees. And David McCulloch and I were the 2 guys that testified. And it becomes an endless argument. And they came up with some sort of Adams memorial off the mall in some circle where there's this it's not DuPont Circle, but somewhere up there, in which Adams would be in the middle of the traffic jams in D.C. And I said, we don't want that there, for God's sakes. McCulloch had the idea that the Adams Memorial should be a library of books and stuff, but nothing has come of this.
We're coming near the end of this week's conversation, but I just wanted to say that for listeners who are interested to delve a bit deeper into this, I can't think of 2 books that I could recommend more highly than your book on Thomas Jefferson, American Sphinx, and your book on John Adams, Passionate Sage. 2 terrific reads. And one of the things you learn in Passionate Sage is Mr. Adams, he had an edge to him, didn't he, sir?
Oh yeah, and I think that for me, Adams is the way to redefine and revise our understanding of the founders, not as perfect human beings, not as demigods, but as, I mean, if they were demigods, what in heaven's name would we have to learn from them? And Adams's grandson, who edited his paper, said, Adams is the man who really shows you the imperfections as well as the perfections of that generation. They very much wanted to be remembered, but they did not wish to be canonized.
I continue to wonder about how well Adams married, and if what would have happened if he had not married Abigail. The accomplishments.
Yeah, she was a salvation for him because, as I had said, she's his ballast. She's his alter ego. She's the one who tells him when he's going off the rails. And she's a fiercely independent woman. Whether she's a feminist is an argument I used to have with my students at Mount Holyoke all the time. And because she's a traditional mother and wife in many respects, but she knows that the future, at some point in the future, women are going to become more equal and get the vote, etc. And Adams is on that side too. But at any rate, the notion that the founders are the greatest political generation we've ever had is, I think, a settled matter. But it doesn't mean that they're all people above criticism or above serious criticism. American history is morally unresolvable. The same nation that goes on to lead the world and save Europe is the same nation that eliminated the Native Americans and maintained the institution of slavery. It's not resolvable.
Just back to Jefferson for a moment, Joe. I want to put a proposition to you. So, in the current debate about who's up and who's down, Adams is up and Jefferson is down.
Among scholars, that's true. Yeah, especially among scholars. Yeah.
Adams is seen as direct. He's visceral. He wears his heart on his sleeve. His language is immediate. There's an immediacy to it. He's honest in a way that Jefferson is not always. And then if you turn to Jefferson, he writes in that marvelous, lucid, early 19th century prose. There's a kind of a lovely poetic cadence to it. It's high-minded. It's filled with lots of abstractions. He's very careful not to reveal his own personal life or his own actual inner feelings about much. And all those things were prized in his time and for a very long period in American history. But more recently, those very virtues of Jefferson make him seem a little artificial and a little disengaged to modern audiences. And so he's losing, because we live in an age which is direct and earthy and visceral and narcissistic and self-pitying, and we wear all of our thoughts on our sleeve on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. So the age, if the medium is the message, this era is more in tune with somebody like Adams than it can possibly be with someone like Jefferson.
I think I very much agree with that, but I think that from a scholarly point of view, the Jeffersonian, the support for Jefferson starts to die in the scholarship in the 50s and the 60s, 1950s and 60s, and you begin to get critical assessments, and it's all because we're looking back to the past through the window of race and slavery. And that becomes a dominant window. And as soon as you do that, you're going to lower Jefferson's reputation. If that's your sole prism, he's not going to look good. But my view is there's an awful lot of other things that you don't want to lose. I mean, the most important thing that he ever did in constitutional terms was the creation of the principle of separation of church and state. That is a massive contribution that many countries in the world can't reach yet. So that it's not a question of all or nothing. There's parts of Jefferson that we cannot lose, and there's parts of Adams that we did lose and we're regaining.
Sadly, gentlemen, we're out of time for this week's conversation. I so enjoy listening to the two of you. Will you come back and speak with us again, sir? I would so look forward to that.
Yes. I got to have somebody to talk to. I'm up here all by myself. The only thing out here now is me, my dogs, and bears.
Well, sir, we're happy to have the chance to expand your audience and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
We've been talking to our friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, who is in Vermont. We are moving through this pandemic by enabling ourselves to have a really rich conversation that we could not otherwise probably have expected. We're so eager to continue that we're going to do more programs along this line. I think 2 more on the Jefferson-Adams correspondent. We've talked up till now till about 1815, but some of the best letters come in the last decade of their lives. And then we'll do a couple more programs where Dr. Ellis sets me right about my book, Repairing Jefferson's America. You've been listening to a very special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you all next week for another important issue of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks for listening.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.